It's just amazing to me that managers at this point are still like fighting that generational push. What's your sense of it?
Yeah. Look, I have a lot of compassion for anyone who's a manager and trying to figure it out, because in most positions, you're an individual contributor and a manager. And it's a very hard balance of, when do I just get the work done? You can hear people tell you till you're blue in the face, you got to develop your people. You're not, but it's like, you were promoted because you were probably the best at your previous job. And so deep down, you believe that if there's a crisis, you will get it done and you'll roll up your sleeves and whatever. And so it's almost always easier to do a task that you have routinized and were promoted because you're good at, than it is to get a novice to do it. And that's not, of course, the only management challenge, but that's a big one.
Welcome everybody back to Direct Application, where we're bridging the gap between leadership theory and real world practice. This is the season finale. We're very excited about it. I'm your host, Matt Harrington. You've joined me through the whole season. We've got a special show today. I'm very honored to welcome Dr. David Yeager to the show. David is a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, co-founder of Texas Behavioral Science and Policy Institute. But the reason I bring him on is this book, Once in a Decade book, author of 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People. His book is landed on bestseller lists, is already reshaping how we think about motivation, identity, respect, and development. Not only for teens, but most importantly for all of you, for a young adult well into their 20s that we are now managing and supervising. David's work challenges outdated assumptions that 10 to 25 is just a bridge to adulthood, instead showing that it is a distinct developmental window where social, neurobiological needs for status, respect, belonging, and purpose are especially powerful. Over the next 30 plus minutes, we're going to explore his research, how it intersects with leadership and generational dynamics, some stuff around organizational culture, and what it takes to build the next wave of great leaders. I hope you enjoy it. Let's dive right in. David, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I want to hop right in, and I've watched a few of your other interviews, and I think this is probably where you start a lot of the interviews, which is help our audience understand these magic numbers of 10 and 25. Your book right here, like I said before, read right through it, all about generations and young people. But help us with the numbers of 10 and 25. What is the general premise behind the book and your work?
Yeah, the premise is just that, surprisingly, not everybody knows this, but adolescence really starts at age 10 and it continues even through the mid-20s. And so 10 is really just the onset of pubertal maturation, and that's an average. It could be a little earlier or a little later. And 25 tends to be the age at which we tend to take on an adult-like role in our culture. And so the surprising thing is that the motivational priorities of young people tend to be really consistent throughout that age range, even though obviously there's all kinds of physical differences and social differences. But the brains are still developing. They're like adapting to their environments. And the tactics for motivation have a lot in common. And that's good news for us, because what it means is that if I'm a manager of a young person, I don't have to only look to management tactics for 22-year-olds. There's actually a lot of stuff I can learn from a great coach, a great parent, a great teacher, a great camp counselor. There are insights that apply even to my problem of working with young people in their 20s.
Yeah. Well, I always like to detour a little bit, because I love speaking to authors and just getting into your head, or even maybe the physical part of it. So how do you've got this idea, you've been working at college universities, you've done a mountain of research, you stand on the shoulders of giants, of Dweck and others, but then you form a book. And so how do you get it from, I think of Brene Brown as the most classic example of kind of having done vulnerability studies for 20 years. And then there's this kind of book outline and goes through all that. So talk to me just personally about, what was that journey like, kind of taking all of that research? Was that something that you started to push out, that you wanted to be captured in? I mean, obviously as a professor, you're always writing and you also have to be published in journals. But this is this is a bestseller right here. So how do you get from A to Z all the way through there?
I mean, Brene was doing, she wasn't publishing her research though. I'm a scientist, and I say that not in a hierarchical way, but more like, I left direct service with young people as a teacher. I was a basketball coach, and I did it because I felt like the skill that I had to contribute to the world was figuring out what motivates young people. And I wanted to become obsessed with the question of how we do better by young people. And I wanted to tell the adults how to do it differently. And I just fell in love with the scientific method as a way to get out of a world where everybody's, making up whatever sounds intuitive to them, and instead testing stuff and putting, common sense under the microscope, as it were. And so that really was my identity, was like, for as much as I realize people don't read academic papers, there's still a gatekeeping function where a lot of nonsense is kept out because we have peer review. And there's, of course, nonsense that gets in. But anyway, I primarily see myself as a scientist, and then and especially as someone at a public institution, right? I'm at the University of Texas. I'm paid for by state taxes. I'm getting federal grants paid for by your taxes and everybody else's. I should be a servant to the people who've paid for that research. And so I never really liked the idea of being, I don't know, like an ego person about, it's all about my reputation. It's like I'm a vessel of science. And it's still how I see myself. And if I'm criticized, fine, but it's at least the story I tell myself about what I'm trying to do. But then people would be interested in what we did, and I'd give a talk, and then they'd be like, all right, great, I love your talk, very inspired. What do I do now? And I was like, I don't know, read Mindset, buy Grit. Like, I was selling my friends' books. I had sold tens of thousands of copies of my friends' books, which is great. They're perfectly fine books. But I was like, but what I would say is still a little different, even if, and it's not like I would contradict Carol and Angela, but more like my emphasis is a little different. And I wanted to have something where if you heard my talk and you're like, awesome, great, I want to do it, then now you've got 400 pages that you can look through of stories, of examples, of activities. And I really wanted it to be a useful, practical tool. And I wrote it as an intervention. So my specialty in psychology is to intervene. I don't just, I measure personality sometimes, but mainly I'm like, how do I change your attitudes and change your behavior? And I wanted the book to be the kind of thing where if I'm convinced I'm doing it right as a manager, like, and I can do no wrong and no one can criticize me, that if you read the book, you're like, I actually could do it a little differently. And I'm inspired to do that. And so that for me was really the crux of it. And then I in terms of the process, I had to make sure that I was not the protagonist of the book. If you read a lot of popular nonfiction by scientists, the basic chapter structure is everybody was an idiot. They didn't know this stuff. And then I did a brilliant experiment. And here's how I did it. And now you can admire me, the brilliant person. And it's like, that's not useful if I'm like trying to manage somebody at McDonald's or at McKinsey or whatever. Right. So it needed to come from the problems of the readers. And that was a long process, was figuring out realistically, what are the puzzles people have if I'm a physician and I'm training med students, if I'm a general counsel and I've got junior lawyers, if I'm a manager at fast food, what are my issues, what are my problems, and how can this book help? And that final part is what convinced me that now it's time.
Yeah. And I shared this with you right before we launched. So this is no news, and it's not an ego boost. But like I said before, I'm one of those devourers of nonfiction. You take it to the beach, and your wife's always like, "Why are you reading like nonfiction stuff, business books on the beach?" But this is one of those once in a decade, once in a generation. I think of the good, the great, and everything that falls underneath that. That once in a while a book comes along, and I think you've really done the good work, David, about pulling it all together: stories, science, theory, practical. Obviously, this podcast, Direct Application, is all about direct application. How do we take big leadership theories and bring it down? So I appreciate doing that. One other question on this kind of theme. I love the concept piece. And I just I wanted to focus in on young people. I wanted to figure that all out. And I find myself to be of that same ilk, just generally liking young professional development, young career development, whether that middle school, high school, and all the way through. Do you find that that's a certain personality type? Because it's when you do go into training, and I'm sure with all the talks that you've had, you probably have plenty of people that come up and then spew all the stuff about other generations. Here's what they get wrong. Here's how they do it. And yet there are a certain amount of people, and I find these even in our managers and trainers, that genuinely want to get better. They may not know all the tools, but they're the ones picking up your book, me included, and going, wow, how do I do this? Do you find that, is there a way to convince that other cohort that it's nothing to do with it? It's just amazing to me that managers at this point are still fighting that generational push. What's your sense of it?
Yeah. I mean, look, I have a lot of compassion for anyone who's a manager and trying to figure it out, because in most positions, you're an individual contributor and a manager. And it's a very hard balance of when do I just get the work done and when do I develop people? And, you can hear people tell you till you're blue in the face, you got to develop your people. You're not, but it's like, you were promoted because you were probably the best at your previous job. And so deep down, you believe that if there's a crisis, you will get it done and you'll roll up your sleeves and whatever. And so it's almost always easier to do a task that you have routinized and were promoted because you're good at than it is to get a novice to do it. And that's not, of course, the only management challenge, but that's a big one. When I talk to leaders at consulting firms where they've got a big client and they have a big pitch and they've got a team, the night before, a lot of them are doing it themselves because they're I'm worst case scenario, I don't sleep, but I land this, client. Yeah. And so I think it's reasonable for a lot of people to be look, I'm not trying to be a mentor here. I'm trying to get the work done. And that's a reason why, frankly, I didn't call the book The Mentor Mindset, which we haven't gotten to yet, right. But that's kind of a punchline. I called it 10 to 25 because I spent a long time just talking about my book at cocktail parties and stuff. And I'd be like, what are you writing about? And I would tell them, and if I was it's a new leadership style that's good for young employees, they're like, okay, it sounds like homework. I'm not doing that. Right. And then if I said, how it's just impossible to get young people to do anything you want them to do? And they're like, yeah. And then I'm like, this helps you get them to do what you want them to do. I'm like, okay, I want to read that. Yeah. And so I think that in general, my approach is to not tell anybody, managers in the workplace, parents, teachers, whoever they are, that they need to do something that's good for others just because it's effective. That's you hear that so many Harvard Business Review articles. You're like, here's the new thing. It works for your employees are happier if you do it. Therefore you should do it. And you're like, okay, but is my life better as a manager? Is my team more effective? And in my opinion, you have to start with what people already care about before they read the book. What people already care about is being effective in their jobs. And so the argument I try to make is that if you're the kind of person that wants to have strict, rigid discipline, you're going to, work till you drop, and you want young people along for that ride, you can still have those high standards. This book is about how to support young people so they meet your standards. If instead your instinct is, I just want people to be grateful, to care for me, to feel like I did a good job. I want my employees to look up to me, et cetera. If you're kind of instinctually more caring, great, keep that. Here's how you raise the standards on your team so that way they accomplish a lot. And that's, in general, my approach.
Yeah, good. Well, let's dive into some of those concepts. There's a lot of them in the book, and obviously we want people to go out and buy the book and learn those, but let's hop into some of them. I think generally a lot of some of the thesis is the belief that young people aged 10 to 25 are inherently incompetent and immature. At least that's what people going into the book might think. And we hear that a lot in trainings, workshops, and things like that. Can you explain what the research actually shows about competence, maturity, decision-making capacity in this age range, 10 to 25? I thought it a fascinating piece of your research in your book.
Yeah, there's a little bit of kind of intellectual history here that's worth understanding. So, you know, let's say 20, 30 years ago, there was not really sophisticated science of what's happening in the brain after childhood, or at least not that was popularly known. And so we kind of thought of young employees as adults. And if they're like adults, but they're still making dumb decisions from our perspective, then they're just bad adults. And then I'm either mad at them, I want to punish them, or I'm like, I'm going to fire you, I'm going to get rid of them. Okay. So there was like basically when you think someone should be fully capable of something and they don't produce, then you go to blame, shame, judgment, etc. And so there was a desire to say, well, actually, their brains are still developing. Therefore, you shouldn't be so blaming and judgmental and impatient. You actually need to work with their developing brains. So the kind of compassionate response was this model that basically said the adolescent brain is not fully baked until your mid to late 20s. And therefore, here's the stuff you got to do to connect with that ill-formed, immature.
People are getting jobs at 18. People are getting jobs, especially out of college, at 22, 23. So to your point, David, I mean, they're still developing for 2 or 3 years while in your care, while in your management, team or whatever, right?
Yeah, and they're not just like developing skill; they're like biologically still developing.
Yeah.
And so then people kind of ran with that idea, which came from a good place, and then used it almost to justify lower expectations for young people, and and to justify the idea that they're incompetent, that their decision making is flawed, it's irrational, it's too emotional, it's not based on reason and logic, and therefore we, with our smart adult, fully formed brains, should be doing all the thinking, and young people should be doing none of the thinking. And that shift was what I call the adolescent incompetence model.
Right.
And it's a zeitgeist. It's as powerful as like the self-esteem movement was. And you don't even realize you're surrounded by that belief until you realize there's an alternative. And just to, clarify it, I mean, during Vietnam, right, the narrative was teenagers' brains are doing great, and therefore we can send all these teenagers to war. And they did. And then pretty soon they're like, well, shouldn't they be able to vote? And then they lowered the voting age. This is under Nixon to 18, right? And that was a presumption of their competence. And basically every year since then, society has chipped away at the narrative that adolescents can think and reason. And now you see new debates like, well, these dumb teenage brains shouldn't be allowed to vote until they're 25 or 28.
Okay.
Anyway, so what I'm trying to push back against is a kind of distortion of the science, because those studies which seem to show that teenagers were neurobiologically incompetent were kind of misinterpreted. So what they would do in a study is like give a teenager a self-control task. And it's like, you can have this amount of money now or this amount of money later. And what do you choose? And if you choose less money now, then you're considered impulsive, right? It's a classic discount rate. And then they would look in their brains and they would see that the areas of the brain associated with logical reasoning seemed to not light up for the teenagers when they were making that choice. And then that was interpreted as teenagers lack a prefrontal cortex. But that's like a misinterpretation of the data, because the reality is like the value of $2 is not that much to a teenager, and especially compared to the value of looking good socially. And if they just changed the task and said, hey, you can have a lot of money later or a little money now, and if you get the money later, you can give it to someone you really like and admire and that you care about their opinion.
Yeah. Then
teenagers showed the most self-control. They delayed gratification the most, and they showed the most activation in the regions of the brain related to thinking and trade-offs. And so, and that's one simple example. There's a ton of other reasons why the science is misinterpreted. But basically the real finding is that when I say the brain is still developing, what I mean is that it's still becoming equipped to pursue meaningful goals in your culture. And it's not obvious what a culture is going to value when that culture is still changing. Think about how much has changed since the advent of AI. And before that, social media, right? The whole idea that you can be, an influencer, right? That's a path to economic success was invented. And all kinds of people in their 50s are like, that's ridiculous, don't do that. And then all kinds of people in their teens did it and then became millionaires in their 20s. And the pace of that like adaptation is actually increasing, especially with AI now that you can outsource lots of stuff.
Well, I do want to get to some of that. Does any of this new, it's social media back then, .com before that for Gen X, do any of those nuanced things, the AI revolution, even I think of just the digital world and the hybrid work and COVID and all that stuff, is that, I would assume that's putting pressure on brain activity as well at the 10 to 25. Would it change anything, or is it still, David, I think, part of the thesis of your book is status and respect, right? Young people want status and respect. How they define it might be a little bit different than how a 50-year-old might define it, but in general, that's what we're all looking for. So do any of the new AI stuff speed that up, slow it down, change it dramatically?
So what older generations want to hear, their clickbait, is that some new cultural change or technology has permanently ruined the brains of young people.
Yeah.
So, we used to hear complaints that, well, now that there's Gmail, you don't have to remember that people emailed you anymore. You can just look it up. Now that there's Google Maps, you don't have to know where you're going anymore. But that's the same argument that they're like, now that we have graphing calculators, we don't have to use the slide rule, and now it's like, no one has to think because they can outsource everything to AI. And every older generation wants to believe that they are smarter and better than the younger generation. And they will listen to anything that claims that the new generation is dumber and more short-sighted and more incompetent. And that will be true for as long as humans are alive, first of all, but it will especially be true when young people are taking older generations' jobs or perceived as taking their jobs. And because then the older people are like, no, you need our smart, self-controlled, reasonable brains from the pre-internet age to be in charge of everything because these impulsive, dumb teenage brains can't do anything. My argument is that is a little different. It's not like people want to treat whatever it is, social media or AI, as like lead poisoning, that you get it as a child from the paint in the walls, and now your brain is ruined for the rest of your life, and you're just wandering around as like a drooling idiot. And that's not really how it works. It's more like human brains are evolved to keep us alive. And the way they keep us alive is they figure out what goals to pursue, like what matters for resources, survival, reputation, relationships. And so we're like problem solving. And when it turns out that you do not have to expend certain energy and certain effort in order to gain relationship resources, status, or whatever, then our brains tend to like not pay attention to those things. And if it turns out that it really matters for our future, our status, our reputation, etc., that we do certain things, then our brains pay attention to it a lot. And that's especially true in adolescence because you haven't yet decided what your contribution is and what your role is. Someone in your 50s it's very different, right? Like for me, like I'm a nerd academic. I've already decided what my contribution is, right? But like if you're 17, or 22, you don't really know what it is. So you should be adaptive. Your brain should be flexible, should be responsive. And so when we say brains are still developing, what we mean is that they're still flexible and responsive to cultural changes in what counts for status. But across generations, all brains are concerned with how to acquire, maintain, preserve status, reputation, etc. The reason young people care about it more is because they don't yet have it. Older people often do. But if you threaten it in adults, they start acting like teenagers, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so we've established, I really appreciate kind of the candidness and to the point of a lot of the older generations feel this way, and here's the reasons why. So we've kind of established our case for change, potentially why. We need to kind of move to a different section. Paint for us a vision of what could happen, and I want you to use your mentor mindset kind of thought process there. So talk to me about define mentor mindset, and then kind of what are you seeing in organizations, not only from a, hey, it's better to be nice to young generations, but also like production improves, relationships improve. And talk to us about mentor mindset and where you kind of paint a vision of potentially what managers and supervisors could do in the future without just complaining about generations.
Yeah, I think the case is that managers have lots of frustrations when they're trying to motivate and engage their employees, young employees, but employees in general. And managers tend to focus on what the frontline employees are supposed to do and why the manager's reasoning is correct for why the frontline employee should do it, but they don't pay attention to how they communicate it. And because of that, they end up threatening the need for status and respect in young employees. And that basically backfires. And so young people, when the manager takes an approach of yell, tell, blame, shame, explain, then younger employees especially feel disrespected, they disengage, they don't listen, it's in one ear, out the other. And that's frustrating for managers because now you've wasted your time trying to explain something to somebody, but also your team is less effective. People are less proactive, they're not going out of their way to do things they're supposed to be doing. They're not checking in when they're confused or lost. They're not collaborating. So all these other things that people are not doing when the manager's approach is yell, tell, blame, shame, explain. And so what we've realized is that there's an alternative where you can still be a demanding manager that has very high standards, that says this team needs to crush it, while also increasing the likelihood that the younger employee does what you're asking. And the way to do that is something we call the mentor mindset, which is basically to accompany your high standards with high support. And basically for any level of demandingness that you are expecting of your employees, your support should match that, right? So if you're not expecting a lot, you don't have to go, maybe they don't need that much support, leave them on their own, whatever. But if you expect, slide deck in 3 days to pitch to a major client, and you've got massive expectations and it's a huge deal and there's huge consequences if they don't do it, and they're left fully alone to do it and you're not involved in any way, then young people are going to feel like they're going to get blamed for something that was impossible to do, and that and they're going to suspect that the manager only did it to save their own reputation and throw you under the bus. And then the employee's not going to be proactively kicking ass on their own, right?
Right.
And so I ended up just studying lots of great managers. This one manager I wrote about was the top manager at Microsoft for a long time, Steph Okamoto. She was recruited to ServiceNow, where then she ran manager excellence. And she was constantly having to make this case at some of the world's most profitable companies where it's Microsoft. It's not Feelings Incorporated.
Sure.
So they have to do real stuff there. And yet they found that the best way to develop and motivate young employees in a way that still improved team performance was to have this mix of high standards and high support. And I'll just end with one very concrete example. We have a project right now where we're working with 30 McDonald's restaurants in West Virginia. And we are training managers on mentor mindset stuff with their frontline crew members. Okay. Now, why would anybody care, right? People don't get hired at McDonald's because they want a nice and friendly manager, presumably, right? And McDonald's managers' number one responsibility is to deliver food quickly.
Yep.
There's like a wire on the ground in the drive-through, and if you don't deliver food within 70 seconds, then corporate knows, and then it's an issue.
Yep.
And there's a timer, and you're ranked against every McDonald's restaurant in the region at all times. And so they're not there to be a mentor necessarily, right? They're there to produce food quickly. And so why in the world would anyone care about mentor mindset? Well, I asked the managers, what are your top frustrations? And the top frustrations are I had this conversation with a young employee, and then the minute the conversation was over, they don't do it, or they quit. And the turnover at McDonald's is 160%. I don't know if you know this. So for every 100, this is unbelievable.
I was going to say, I was trying to do the math on 100, but go ahead.
For every 100 jobs, every year they have to hire 160 people. It's not a joke. It costs McDonald's $4 billion a year just in HR, like hiring, training, managing new employees. Okay. So maybe it can't be 0%, but if you just got it to 100% turnover, you're talking saving billions of dollars, right? What's the number one reason why people quit at McDonald's? It's because they feel yelled at by their bosses, right? And they're not getting fired. It's impossible to get fired from McDonald's, basically, unless you bring a gun to work or something like that. So it's if they're quitting, and they're quitting because, and what are managers doing? They're like, you can't wear a bracelet when you're making food because the bracelet could fall off into the food and then it could break someone's teeth. It's a health and safety hazard, or it could get caught and now you're going to burn yourself and it's a lawsuit. So they yell, tell, blame, shame, explain, don't wear a bracelet. And here's an example of mentor mindset. Don't do that. Don't yell, tell, blame, and shame and explain. Instead say, is there a reason why you're wearing your bracelet? And then wait for an answer. And guess what? Do you know the number one reason why people wear jewelry when they shouldn't on their crew?
Let's know.
It's because it has personal significance.
Sure.
It's like a friend was killed in a drive-by and they went to the funeral and they put a necklace on and said, I'll never take it off, or a bracelet. Or they exchanged it with their girlfriend and they're like, it's a sign of her undying love and I will never take it off. And if I do, it means I've betrayed you. So if I'm a manager, I'm yelling at that employee, I'm making them choose between the love of their life and undying loyalty and integrity or their McDonald's manager. And they take the hemlock it's a Romeo and Juliet situation, right? So if you just ask them, is this important to you? They're like, yeah. Like, do you think you could honor the love of your girlfriend by wearing it as a bracelet on your ankle? And they're like, yeah. And then it's not an issue.
So
it's not like you're being overly nice or going out of your way to be a mentor. It's just like problem solve collectively. Don't start with a presumption of incompetence that they're trying to break your rules because they're like recalcitrant idiots. Like presume good faith, then troubleshoot with people, and then they're loyal, they stick around, they work harder, and then you're more effective.
Yeah. It reminds me a lot of kind of what we call belief behavior conversations, right? So your behavior is you're wearing the anklet and I want you to take it off, but what's the belief behind that? And so you gotta go and have that kind of Socratic dialogue of asking a lot of questions about digging in, and I really appreciate you sharing that with our audience today. All right, David, we're gonna hit the lightning round because we've got a couple minutes left. This has been a really fun interview. I could go all day, but at a certain point, a podcast has to end. So, couple rapid fire. Give us a sentence or two. Direct application. If somebody was listening to this podcast, what is a manager supervisory role? What's one or two things they should start to do on the next Monday morning or even sooner that's actionable and practical?
The simplest thing is transparency. Okay. Explaining in advance when you have tough, rigorous, demanding standards that you're doing it because you believe in their potential, and then explaining the ways you're going to walk the journey with them and the support you've either already put in place or will put in place so that they meet the standard. That's in our heads. We almost never say it. But because people are used to being given impossible tasks and then blamed later when it didn't go well, not just at work, but in school too, then people presume that's what we're doing. So simplest thing is to not actually change really what you're doing, but to be more transparent about what you're doing. And then the follow-up is, if you do it wrong and screw up a conversation, you can do a do-over. You can go say, hey, look, this is an important thing. I needed you to do it, but I should have been more curious about why it was hard for you. Would you mind explaining what the challenges were? I promise to, be more curious in the future, but let's work towards a solution. People will remember the do-over more than they remember the initial poor conversation.
Great. We call this one the switch. What's a leadership idea you've once believed but have outgrown in your maturity, older generation? So what's something that kind of has always been an axiom of yours that might have now you're looking in and go, that's more of a myth, or that's, now that I've kind of gone through a couple iterations of my career, I don't believe that as much anymore.
I guess I'm thinking about my research lab because I manage 40 people or something like that. And I think I probably believed that if all I did was explain why what we're doing is important and matters, that people would be okay doing seemingly impossible tasks, like the equivalent of climbing Mount Everest. And we've done some incredible stuff in our lab, like studies no one's ever done before. And yet everyone's exhausted afterwards and doesn't want to do it again. And I think I needed to ask in advance. I still need to sell the importance and the vision, but ask in advance how they anticipate needing support and put that in place before we go decide to metaphorically climb Mount Everest together.
Great. Leadership anchor. When it gets hard, loud, what's kind of your anchor? And, oftentimes faith or science or reading a good book or going to the beach. What's an anchor when when that research project becomes a little too much? What do you kind of revert back to? And I don't want to answer the question for you, but I really do love where you started at kind of a steward and a vessel. But I don't want to answer your question for you. So leadership anchor.
Yeah, I mean, things really drag when I'm doing a project that I feel forced to do that I don't really care about. And it's just like, it's somebody else's project and it's a grant we have, or it's a contract or something. And so I almost always go work on a study or a project that is the reason why I became a scientist. So my way of procrastinating is like analyzing data in R, and I'm just like running machine learning models and doing Bayesian statistics and stuff like that. And that's how I procrastinate. But outside of work, I coach baseball and basketball, and I get really serious about the right way to teach 9 to 13-year-olds hitting and pitching and basketball form. So I take that very seriously.
Which probably gave you, just the anchor to your research was literally trying to teach 9 and 10 and 11-year-olds how to play a sport. So,
well, it's funny. My 9-year-old likes to roast me, and he's like, the other day I finished a talk, and then he was there, and then he was like, "Can I do a stand-up bit at the end?" And I was like, "Okay." And it was like, this is like hundreds of Asian scholars, like very serious, in Hong Kong, and then he's like, a lot of kids say their dad doesn't understand them, but I know my dad doesn't understand me because I'm 9, and his book is 10 to 25.
Solid. He's on his way to stand up for sure. All right, last one. Before we wrap up, we will end each interview episode with this. Read, listen, eat. What's something you're reading right now, David? What's something you might be listening to, audiobook, podcast you really love? And, one that we love to add, what's something you've eaten or cooked? So sometimes on the show, we have great cooks and they're working something magical, or you went to like you said, Beijing and had this great meal. So read, listen, eat.
So I'm reading this book called The Way Out right now. It's by Devin O'Neill, and he's a ESPN outdoor magazine, kind of an outdoor adventure journalist, and it's a story of a bunch of families who went on a pretty mundane hut trip in the Rocky Mountains, and then it turned tragic. And it's partially, a kind of John Krakauer style adventure story, but it's also a lot about the relationships between dads and sons and dads and daughters, and then at the end, how a community deals with grief. So it's got all these really profound themes while also being a page turner. So highly recommend The Way Out, Devin O'Neill. I'm listening. So Khruangbin just re-recorded their first album. They're a Houston-based kind of like jam. They've done a lot of great songs with like Leon Bridges and stuff. Anyway, they just re-recorded their first album, and it's awesome. So it's on repeat in my house. And then eating. When I cook barbecue, and I like Texas style, Aaron Franklin style barbecue. I take it seriously. I have a journal, and I like change one thing every week, and then I update it. So I've been doing a lot of beef ribs because it doesn't take as long as brisket, but it's just as delicious.
I want to make sure that that we heard you. You keep a journal of data for your barbecue.
Yeah, like every Sunday I'll change one thing. I'll be like, I'm going to do it overnight, or I'm going to wake up at 3, or I'm going to change the wood. And then, because, you got to do it enough to figure out the right way to do it. And then if you change your grill or smoker in any way, you got to, adapt it. So now I feel like I know what I'm doing with Texas style barbecue.
Great. Well, hey, Dr. David Yeager, I really appreciate you hopping on. This is going to be our final episode of the season this year. We're going to come out in late December on this. And so What a way to end. I just really appreciate the interview and your thoughtful, candid, practical way that we might be able to work with generations across the full workplace. So I really appreciate you joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, everybody. Hope you really enjoyed that interview. It was great to connect with David. His work reminds us that leadership isn't just about output, results, and efficiency. It's fundamentally about human connection, human development, dignity, and respect. By honoring the social biological drivers for status, respect, meaning, and belonging, especially for those in the 10 to 25 developmental window, our kiddos, our young adults, our young professionals, we can unlock immense potential for those individuals and even our teams and organizations. For our listeners, if you lead a team, coach younger employees, mentor, parent, manage, or teach, I encourage you to read the book, 10 to 25. Think about who on your team could benefit from more of a mentor mindset. And ask yourself, are you creating a culture where respect, trust, and growth matter as much as performance? This episode will drop in the next couple of weeks. As I mentioned before, this will close out our season 1. Hopefully, you've enjoyed some of our interviews over the last couple of months. I hope you did. If you found value in these conversations, please subscribe, share, but more importantly for this episode, send me feedback. We're going to look at season 2, who else we should invite on the show, things you liked, areas we can improve upon the show. So please, if you can, send us some feedback. I'll have an email in the show notes for you to do that. Of course, with this episode, you can watch and listen on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and more. Explore additional resources at www.harringtonbrands.com. And as always, take what you've heard, make it your own, and apply it directly.